The escarpment makes its own manners. The basalt rim carries a strict edge, and the wind respects it until the hour it does not. I worked the ridge station because I had argued for being close to the source, and now the source breathed against my tent walls like a courteous animal asking to be let in. I began as I always began. I unzipped the flap, tasted dust, and looked for the pale line where the high cloud shoulders the stone. I named the smells under my breath so I would not chase omens by accident. There was wet clay from last night's runoff. There was the tin of old lightning in the fences. There was the fainted paper smell of my notepad because I kept it tucked near my ribs. Routine is a shelter. I set the barometer where the table sits flat, tapped the glass with a knuckle, and waded through the small pause that separates reading from rumor. The needle liked to hesitate when the escarpment told it to, and I had learned not to take that personally. I clipped the handheld anemometer to the same carabiner I always used and ran the check I could do in sleep. Blades free, pivot easy, coupler snug. The field antenna had weathered the night without complaint. I walked the guy lines once, then again, fingers finding the familiar roughness where the cord had been singed by arcing air in a dry storm 2 seasons back. I could taste that memory on the wind as a metallic afternote, or I could simply be human and superstitious. Either way, I wrote it down. The radio was my partner in this place. I woke it softly and tested the throat of the channel. Bass answered with its own morning voice, the clipped calm of someone counting resources against a week that wanted more of them. We exchanged the usual. Expected developments, timing windows for balloons, chatter from patrols, a reminder to log any oddities with posture instead of color. I said yes, because that is what a careful person says when someone at a desk is trying to keep the ledger straight. Storm week in the Berg means towers that bloom out of nothing and stack on each other as if they were late to a meeting. From the ridge I could see the high veld breathing toward the cliffs across a long breath. We tracked those breaths. I sketched a rough field of motion on my notepad with arrows that leaned as the morning warmed. The first balloon went up into a sky still blue enough to pretend innocence. I sent it with a quiet blessing and watched the string take the tiny tremors that tell you the air is not as simple as the light suggests. The anemometer told one story in my hand, the balloon told another. That is not an anomaly, that is any day with terrain. I took the second balloon out of its sleeve and paused to let my fingers learn it again. Latex always carries a particular smell in the cold, clingy and pale. The plastic edge of the valve bit the glove through habit rather than malice. I breathed, I counted without numbers, and then I stopped, because the radio put a shape into the static that did not belong to weather. It wasn't a word yet. It was the intention of a word. I thumbed the volume down to a murmur and held it there long enough to hear the wind forget its place. Then I put the balloon away. An omen is only an omen if you make it into one. I made a note, static with cadence, not windborne. The field antenna stared into the valley as if it could learn character directly, which I knew was superstition in boots. Still, I raised it another palm's width and walked the circle again. The escarpment's face took on a wash of shimmer, the way heat makes a road look like water. It was too early for that shimmer, too cool for that mirage. I told myself it was moisture from the falls lifting like smoke, even though the falls heaved and drummed from rain days ago and should have lost their spit by now. The thunder did not begin so much as ease its weight onto the day. It lived in the stone first and then in the air. I checked the barometer again. The needle tapped a rhythm that my ear wanted to call familiar. That is the trap. Rhythm invites names. I wrote, needle stutter at steady wind, possible interference from line tension. I have learned to accuse rope before I accuse the sky. The call for a midday sounding came earlier than I preferred. A trough was folding a wrong way on the models, and the office wanted more texture in the feed. I looked at the cliff, then at the map, and then at the cliff again. The map draws the edge as a neat contour, a civilized boundary between climb and fall. The ground likes to overlay its own paperwork. The track I had flagged yesterday sat a little to the left of where my pencil said it ought to be. That happens when one is tired. That happens when one is afraid. I had slept, and I refused the second explanation in favor of the first. But I still walked the flag line slow and pressed a palm against each marker as if the cloth could console me. The wind lifted a notch, and then remembered its lessons and sat down. I listened for the grit hiss a downslope flow makes when it learns the language of the ledge. It was not there yet. The handheld anemometer told me something that felt like a cough. Gusts make the blades chatter. This was a softer thing, a reluctance, the sense that the air wanted to be elsewhere and had been instructed to remain. I do not write that last sentence in a log. I write, intermittent slackening, no visible cause. Base called, with a tone I recognized from long seasons. They wanted the second balloon now, sooner if I could make it sing. I argued by being practical. I said the inflow was unsteady and the channel had a burr. They told me the river towns were listening, and the schools had asked for delay windows for bus routes. That kind of detail gathers behind the ribs. You can be precise for yourself. You are permitted to be kind for others. I said I would go. I worked the balloon with deliberate hands. I let the gas take its place. I tied the neck. I checked the knot 3 times under the guise of habit. I held the line like a patient animal and walked to the marked spot where I always surrender the string to sky. The radio rode my shoulder, and I told myself I would not listen for words in it. I let the balloon rise until the pull took on that bright tone of near freedom. Then I gave it and watched the skin turn from a thing I could touch to a thought. The radio coughed. I heard my own check phrase return, not as an echo, but as an answer with a timing that belonged to the ridge, not the set. I said the phrase again, this time adding a small error to see if the error would come back to me or go on without me. The static learned the new seam, as if it had been reading over my shoulder. I know how skywave behaves. I know how repeaters can create ghosts of your own voice. This was neither, because the delay belonged to the ground. It moved along the cliff line like a hand brushing lichen, and I could follow it with my eyes as one follows a snake in brush by listening before looking. I did not write that down. I wrote, multipath suspected, local reflection, monitor. The balloon tugged once and then steadied. The anemometer in my pocket ticked as if something had touched it, though I had not taken it out. I removed it and held it at eye level. The blades did not move. The housing felt faintly warm where the escarpment breeze should have cooled it. I closed my fist lightly around it to see if I was inventing warmth. It kept its temper. The sky gave a low roll that I recognized as a far discharge. The cliffs held the sound a heartbeat too long and handed it back with an accent I could not place. I stood with the useless instrument in one hand and the radio in the other and felt the ridge lean in. When I tried to walk the line between flags to reset my frame, the distance between them had a way of stretching that the legs do not appreciate. Steps I had counted without counting yesterday outnumbered themselves without digits. The track did not wander, it grew. I shortened my stride and brought the flags back into agreement by being stubborn on purpose. When I reached the last one before the drop, a cold pocket wrapped my knees and let my shoulders alone. That is not how air usually behaves on a sunlit lip. Cold will pool low and keep its peace. It does not select a body part and negotiate. I laughed once because that is what I do when rulebooks forget me. Then I said into the mic that I would hold the next release until the ridge calmed its new trick. Bass sent a careful silence and then thanked me by name in a voice that was not quite theirs. Gratitude is not a thing you expect from a channel. I replied the field cliché about copy and then turned the volume down. The cliff carried a sigh as if the whole wall had remembered to breathe after a long wait. I wrote, personation on channel, very likely bleed from distant net. The sky darkened along the high line where storms learned to stand in file. The cells did not march. They stacked, one atop another, patient and grave, like a set of books arranged by weight rather than topic. I folded the notepad closed and pressed it against my chest for warmth that could be trusted. The radio on my shoulder put out a last little shape. I did not unravel it. The balloon went on without me, a bright idea the valley was free to edit. I told myself to treat the coming hour like any other, which is to say, believe nothing until the same thing happens twice, and even then write as if responsible to someone who will never forgive theater. The needle on the barometer steadied, as if soothed by the decision. The cliff face, which had held its shimmer like a veil, let the light dull into its real stone. My hands felt the antenna guy line hum and then fall quiet, the way a drumhead learns the pitch you demand of it and then gives you silence while you count. I have chased storms long enough to know when the weak decides to graduate. The ridge had that posture. I stood at my post with my devices and my plain words, and made room in my head for the small step to become a pattern. The radio was an animal beside me, pretending sleep. The sky was a ledger filling itself in a hand I did not recognize. I was a meteorologist on a line of old rock with a job to do, and a sense that the tools would not be content to remain tools. Somewhere out in the valley, a bus route would be waiting for instruction. Somewhere higher up, The cells arranged themselves into a polite stack and refused to drift. I waited for the next repeat of the wrong thing so I could admit it. I woke before the ridge spoke and listened to the tent cloth whisper against itself. The small syllables fabric makes when a place means to keep its own counsel. The barometer slept under its cover. The anemometer lay where I had set it, and I admit I reached to feel whether it had held that impossible warmth. It felt honest now, cool with the slight damp that rises from ground after night breath. I set the kettle, not for romance, but because steam tells you truths about air that numbers hide. The first thread rose straight and learned a small lean only when it cleared the shelter lip. Downslope then, but shy, good to know. Base wanted the morning feed early. They spoke about routes and bridges and a headmaster who liked to stand on the veranda and point to clouds for children who were learning names. The channel clipped and settled between phrases. Not the unruly hiss of a tired set, but a polite hush, as if the ridge had joined the call and was trying not to breathe too hard into the room. I logged the request and wrote the small promise I make to myself when maps begin to borrow my certainties. Keep the task small and plain. Let the sky write its letters on the page. I walked the flags because I needed them to forgive me for yesterday's stretch. The cloths had stiffened in the night and held a dry starch from drift that fell like sugar when I pinched a corner. The distance behaved again, each gap the old stride that has taught my knees to trust terrain. Still, a thought stuck where thoughts like to lodge behind the eyes. The root often repents its mischief after dark, but the stone remembers. I placed a palm on the rimrock and let it answer with its usual deep chill. It did, and then, for the span of a breath, I felt a pulse under the skin. Not the rattle one gets from a far discharge, but the tiny thud of something settling tighter than comfort. I removed my hand and told myself to drink more water. First release went without comment. Balloon, knot, line, glance, let go. The wind spoke in stable sentences. I charted the ascent in pencil-dull strokes because the notepad paper took graphite better when I did not insist on sharpness. The field antenna stood a touch taller than usual. I had left it raised and decided not to second-guess that choice. The radio offered me background that had learned manners in an office. Between base and me, there lived a quiet I could set a cup on. Only once did it tilt, and then it was not a sound but a cadence that remembered the shape of my check phrase and practiced the vowels without the consonants, like a child at a window mouthing the words of a song. I wrote, "Cadence reappears, no content, ignore." Storm Week had begun to arrange its furniture. Towers over the high veld put their backs to the sun and grew elbows. The stack to the west held a discipline I respected. It did not race, it accrued. The falls across the valley were still too loud for the hour. Spray lifted like breath from a sleeping animal that dreams hard. I read the barometer, which had abandoned last night's stutter for a sliding walk that made my shoulder tighten. I have learned not to name that slope aloud. I only note it and manage what it implies, which on this ridge is restraint. I filled the second balloon while the kettle cooled to a good temperature for the cheap tea I carry, because it does not mind being forgotten. Latex tugged my gloves and clicked against the table edge. When I lifted my eyes, I saw the shimmer again on the cliff line, as though a thin skin of warm air had thrown itself over a body still chilled. It is common to see that at midday. It is less common when the rock has not yet stored heat. I tried to catch a scent that would help me place it and found the small coppery taste that sometimes follows close lightning. The sky did not own such a memory this morning. The fences did. I could not argue with metal that remembered burns I had not seen. Base asked for a wind profile along the face and over the lip. I said I could give them the latter with confidence and the former with caution. The reply came trimmed and thankful, followed by a pause that wore my name like a badge and did not belong to any voice on the roster. I said the practical words one says when one wants to avoid superstition. The radio decided to behave. Still, I shortened the leash on the set and checked the antenna ground link, then exiled the motion to routine by tapping each lug with a knuckle and saying out loud that they were tight. I sent the second balloon. It learned the low curl and shouldered through it, able but unwilling. The line brushed my wrist and told me something about shear that made a note in my ribs. The anemometer started in my palm before I had raised it to meet the air, a little flick as if a small creature had breathed across it from inside the casing. I held the instrument to eye height and watched the blades spell a hesitant circle that did not match the wind on my cheek. When I cupped it, the blades did not stop. They deepened, a private spin that I could not attribute to any branch of physics that had helped me earn this job. I set it down open on the table until the falseness lost interest. The blades folded back into honesty. I wrote, "Housing warmth absent, phantom start persists. Consider contamination or remnants." I needed a ground truth to keep from chasing specters, so I took the sling out to the rim and read, with my mouth and skin, how eager the air was to scrape heat out of water. It told me nothing dramatic, only that the day wanted labor on the slope, and courtesy at the top. When I turned, the flags presented their mild faces as they should. I let my shoulders drop. I nearly kept them there until the radio decided to clear its throat with my own voice. It said my check phrase back to me with a kink I had not put in it. Then the static tugged at a name I did not recognize, a clipped call sign that sounded like a surname, less a vowel. I answered with procedure, even though I knew that was theater for my benefit. The pause that followed grew hair and sat between us like a stray dog that has learned to porch. I left the channel open just a fraction longer than manners allow, then shut it quietly and wrote a nothing phrase in the log so my hand would have something to do. The ridge did not move. The air did not tilt. The cliff held its light as a lady might hold a shawl against weather that had not yet arrived. Orders came downrange to move the portable gauge to a spur farther along the line. The model desk wanted better coverage where the cells would tighten their belts toward evening. I stood with the request like a person touching the edge of a map that has begun to slip under glass. The spur is not a difficult walk. It is a particular one, because the path makes a shallow S around a run of cracked dolerite that rings if you find the right tread. I went, because that is the oath you make when you take a post under sky. You go where the question is. The walk was ordinary until I passed the boulder that gleams like a wet seal after rain. The sound changed there. Ridge noise is a mix of distance and small, near things. What reached me was neither. It was a hush that had angle. The hair on my forearms rose only to half height, as if the body had been called to attention and then told to stand easy. I rounded the S and found that the spur had grown by a step or two in the night. Not a trick of fatigue. My legs know this place. The flags I had once left as a courtesy to visiting techs now sat a breath farther apart, each still tied where I had tied it, each new gap a persuasion rather than a lie. I counted with muscle memory and refused to write a number. I wrote instead, "Spacing feels generous, remeasure later with cooler head." At the spur, I set the little gauge and knelt to run the cable. The soil took my stake without complaint. A faint odor of crushed wild onion rose and then faded under the cleaner scent of damp stone. The cable jacket felt tacky with the kind of stick that belongs to heat, but the sun lay behind a gauze of high ice and should have made everything crisp. I wiped my palm on my trousers and kept to the task. When I keyed the radio to report placement, the channel returned a soft syllable that fit my mouth but did not come from it. I said my name and watched the cliff for the shimmer. It obliged, a thin veil over the fall line, then quit so quickly that my eye wondered if it had invented the whole thing to keep itself entertained. The work took longer than pride prefers because I tested the ground again and again, as if the cable might learn a new route while my back was turned. When I stood, the stack to the west had thickened without drift. The top held a clean anvil that seemed older than the rest of the column. You do not get age in a single day's convective tower. You get youth pretending age. That should have reassured me. It did not, because the feeling on the ridge was of a class attendant who has asked row after row to be quiet and finally has their wish. I returned to the station with the small lag you accept when a place begins to lean its rules. The barometer's needle had steadied into its downward walk, a sober pace that nods to consequence. The anemometer behaved like a tool again. The notepad had taken the sweat from my shirt and smelled like warm paper, a comfort. I reported the spur install and offered the wind profile I could defend. Base thanked me and added a gentle request to stay on channel even during maintenance. The voice felt right. The static, however, flexed after the sign-off and pushed a word that was almost my call sign and almost not, as if the cliff had heard us asking each other to be careful and had practiced the grammar for a later use. I did not tell anyone that. I set the kettle again, because steam is plain. The thread rose, learned its lean, and broke where wind meets roof edge. I watched it fail with relief and put the cup down on the map. The ridge settled around me as if it had chosen a chair. I picked up the radio and asked for a routine check with base, more for the comfort of a human voice than for data. The answer came promptly. After it, a faint echo traced the cliff from north to south and said my check phrase in a tone that sounded like an apology. I said nothing. I wrote nothing. I sat with my tools around me like a circle of old dogs and waited for the second instance that would force me to admit a pattern and pay the price of naming it. By the time the light took color, the map on my table showed its own opinion about the day. The drawn lines had crept together in the night, close enough to make my teeth set. Isobars do not care for dramatics. They close ranks when work is due. I traced the ridge with a blunt pencil, then set the pencil down so I would not overthink the graphite and call it omen. The barometer knew its role and walked down with the slow dignity of an official carrying a document. I tapped the glass because superstition is a tool when you keep it on a short leash. Base wanted a tighter cadence on the feeds. River towns were jittery. The desk spoke with the steadiness people adopt when they are not yet afraid, but can see where fear will sit. They asked if the field antenna could be reoriented to peer along the escarpment face for a better read on echoes and lightning bait. They did not say why they trusted echoes more than models, but I could guess. The stack to the west had stopped pretending it would drift. It held like a choir refusing to leave the stage. I made a list because lists lower the heart. Guy lines, anchor check, rotor bearings in the wind head, cable strain relief, grounding strap integrity. I said each item aloud and touched each with the deliberate gentleness that keeps hands honest. The strap felt colder than the metal it hugged, a little ribbon of winter in warm air. When I gripped the mast to lean it, a faint sting moved through my palm, as if the sky had licked its teeth. I grounded myself against the frame, waited out the prickle, and chalked it to static born of dry grass and haste. Haste is a liar, so I slowed. The first balloon of the day went up clean. The line played a little tune against my glove and taught me where the shear had taken to living. I marked the flight with quiet strokes and let the data stand without decoration. The anemometer behaved, which would have calmed me if the radio had not chosen that moment to clear its throat with a voice like mine. It was not imitation, it was rehearsal, the set practicing my cadence with the consonants shaved thin. I replied with the minimum that kept me honest and logged the event as interference, while the part of me that lives under the ribs took its own notes in a language no one else will read. I wanted ground truth to tie me to the ridge. I took the sling and walked to the lip, where the steam thread from the kettle likes to choose its lean. The air there had a taste of iron that belonged to storms still distant. The falls breathed hard across the valley, louder than made sense for the hour. Spray rose in a veil fine enough to be thought, rather than water. I held my fingers into the flow that rolled off rock and waited for the cold that should cut bone. It gave me a cool that lacked bite, as if the air had rehearsed chill and forgotten the last step. I wrote nothing for that. Some things you hold. Orders arrived soft but heavy. Reposition the portable gauge again, closer to the notch where the stack would arm itself by afternoon. I looked toward that notch and felt my jaw set against choices. The spur is honest but narrow, and the ground there rings if you get casual. I went because the desk pays me to go, and because I tell myself the ridge respects plain work. I slung the gauge and briefed the radio with my route like I do when I want company that will not crowd me. As I walked, the distance did its small trick again. Flags that had behaved yesterday were a shade more generous today, each gap holding an extra breath I could not accuse of lying, because cloth tells no tales. I would measure later. I would not arm the mind with numbers when the mind was already keen to build stories. Near the boulder that looks wet in any weather, the sound changed as before, less a hush than an attention. The hair on my arms flirted with a rise, and then remembered professionalism. I rounded the familiar S and found the spur where the notebook says it lives, only a step further along than my boots remembered. Setting the gauge should have taken a short chorus. It asked a full song. The soil accepted the stake, then loosened as if regretting its hospitality, so I set it again deeper, without speaking to the ground like a fool. The cable jacket wore that tack again, sticky the way warm plastic sticks, except the air around my face still carried a polite chill. I ran the line with care, avoided the sharp edges, and pressed the connectors together until they made the tiny sigh that tells you two surfaces have agreed. When I keyed the radio to report placement, the channel said my name perfectly, and then went empty. Base followed with the real reply. I scribbled in the log. Duplicative address, likely from crossband artifact. I did not believe myself. Back at the table, the barometer needle polished its downward stroll. The anemometer read steady flow, and then, in a span thinner than a blink, learned a brief counterdrift at ankle height, the kind of sneaky creep air gets when terrain wants to edit. I crouched and felt it with my wrist. There it was, cool and insistent, flowing against the slope as if the valley had begun to exhale under protest. Upslope is a language for later in the day. This was earlier than manners allow. I wrote that in plain speech and underlined nothing, because underlines make stories bigger than they need to be. The radio gave me a gift I had not asked for. A voice, thinner than proper audio, repeated my last wind report with the slight shape of a smile in it. It is a cruel trick of signal paths that they can add warmth. This was not warmth. This was the idea of warmth, the way a drawing of a sun has rays that do no work. I requested base confirm last transmission in the driest tone I own. They confirmed and asked if I had heard the echo on their side. I said no and left it at that. They did not press. We all have our small mercies. I began the midday sounding early to build buffers where I could. The balloon took the string with a hunger I associate with layers trying not to share space. As it rose, I tracked a faint shimmer crawling the cliff line, like a patient column of ants. Heat illusion, the brain wants to call it, but the sun was filtered and the rock had not earned such mirage. The shimmer broke and reformed in tidy segments between buttresses, as if guided by fences the eye could not see. I remembered the way the static had walked the wall the day before, and said aloud, to the devices and to myself, that I was following a normal convective boundary. The antenna agreed by doing nothing. Base brought the pressure of errands. A school had decided to dismiss early if I could offer a polite slope for the next hour. The bus routes still wanted their windows. The office asked if the ridge would behave. They know better than to ask that, but people want reassurance when a map begins to close its hands. I told them the truth. Cells steady, inflow bilayered, fall lines showing odd restraint. There was silence, then a thanks, then the channel pressed my name against my ear in a whisper that did not belong to any person on my list. I cut the volume to a level that lives just above zero and left it there to remind myself that choice is still mine. I walked the lip again to be sure my fears had not learned feet. The flags stood as if set for inspection. The distance between them felt consistent. My boots found the old rhythm, and the ground did not slide beneath me. Still, when I reached the last marker, a pocket of air took my shins and refused my chest. The temperature trick from yesterday had returned with better posture. I spoke to it in the way one speaks to machinery that is on the edge of misbehaving. I said, not now. It did not agree, but it did not escalate. That, on this ridge, counts as a conversation. The kettle on the stove gave me the thread I needed. It rose straight, learned its lean, and then trembled without breaking, as if the air at roofline had developed a conscience. I held a hand over it and felt a flicker that suggested charge. The hairs on my forearm stood, then rolled flat. I turned the flame off and let the quiet return. The falls across the valley dropped in volume for a breath, and then surged as if they had remembered a script. The stack to the west thickened without moving. Age upon youth, a column preparing a lecture. Near mid-afternoon, the radio settled into a mood. Between transmissions, it practiced saying the call sign I had not claimed. The cadence shortened until the pronunciation matched the walk of the barometer needle, a rhythm I could not unhear once I had noticed it. I kept my fingers from the volume knob, because restraint is a discipline like any other. I wrote in the log, isobars, now tight over escarpment. Expect boundary surprises. Maintain channel discipline. Do not anthropomorphize. The last instruction was for me alone. When the balloon string tugged with a sudden lightness, I looked up expecting a gust to have sliced it. The line was whole. The balloon had simply stepped into an alleyway of air that wanted to hurry it along. That alley angled in a way that ran counter to the stone. The cliff did not welcome such geometry. It tolerated it. I felt the ridge harden under my soles and knew the week had turned its page. The desk called for one more profile before dusk. I said yes without drama and set the kit, my hands steady from long practice and my thoughts trying to stay small. The radio, quiet at last, sat like a dog by the door that has learned a stranger's knock and waits to see if I will let it answer. I took my tea without sugar because sweets make the hands restless, and I needed the hands to be quiet. The isobars had drawn close enough that the map felt like a fist, and the stack across the valley kept its posture like a choir that had decided to hold a single note until it learned a new meaning. Base asked for another profile along the face and above the lip, and they wanted it quick, the way people ask when they know the clock is not on their side. I said I would give them what the ridge allowed. I folded the notepad open to a fresh page and touched the corner to the table, a small ritual that helps paper remember it is work. The barometer walked its steady slope. I tapped the glass to keep my superstition honest and set the field antenna a breath taller to rake the escarpment's edge. The grounding strap felt colder than the frame again, as if it owned its own weather. I breathed slow and counted the breaths without numbers, because this place punishes mathematics that is not attached to something you can hold. The handheld anemometer waited on the table, like a dog that has learned the words, but not the rules. I left it there until I needed a truth. When I keyed the radio for a routine check, the channel cleared without fuss. Then it put a word into the space after the sign-off, a clipped call sign that belonged on a roster and did not live on mine. It had the stance of a surname shorn of a vowel, a shape I could carry in the mouth, but would not. I asked base if they had attempted to hail a partner station. They had not. They requested I confirm line of sight to the repeater and any unusual corona on the mast. I looked at the metal with the eyes mechanics like to use and saw nothing flash, nothing bite. I said the line was clean. They thanked me by name. The radio, after they finished, thanked me by another name that landed with the lightness of a practice slip. I did not answer it. Storm Week is a teacher with a cane. It taps in the same place until you either learn or break. I sent the first sounding and let the string tell its story. The balloon climbed, met a boundary that behaved like glass, hesitated, then shouldered through with workmanlike grace. My notepad caught the motion in strokes I did not sharpen. The anemometer spun a modest tail when I lifted it. Then, as if the ridge had whispered in its shell, the blades pressed into a slower rhythm that did not match the air on my face. When I set the instrument down again, it returned to honesty without apology. I wrote, "Transient mismatch between instrument feel and cheek read. Monitor for repeat. Do not indulge." Bass wanted placement shifted for a moment to the slot between buttresses where the echo field has, in other years, turned unruly. I took the gauge and walked the path that now pretended innocence. The flags had decided to behave, perhaps out of pity. The ground still stretched itself by a breath beyond memory around the S, as if the dolerite wanted to keep me a little longer among its broken teeth. Halfway to the slot, the world put on the hush with angle again. My forearms thought about rising, and then stood easy, trained by work and stubbornness. I told the radio I was crossing the ringing stones and would transmit again once the gauge found a seat. The channel replied with a simple copy. After that, the call sign without owner tried the sound of my given name in a register that felt almost kind. I walked through it like a person passing smoke. At the slot, I set the stake deeper than pride likes. The soil held, then loosened, then consented. The cable jacket wore that faint tack that belongs to heat without a source. I ran the line, pressed the connectors home until they gave their small breath, and took one step back to listen to the ridge. The falls spoke across the valley, not louder, not softer, but with an odd steadiness, the sort of constancy that belongs to recordings, not water. I turned my head to upset the illusion. The sound refused to follow the movement as liquid ought. I wrote nothing, because some notes become anchors and keep the mind from moving when it should. I returned to the station and found the barometer needle deeper along its errand. The kettle thread rose, leaned, and died just where roofline trained it to break. I pulled the field antenna half a palm to the north and listened for sparks. None. The radio behaved for a count of breaths, then asked for me in the call sign that I did not own. It put a small hitch in the vowel, the way people do when they are repeating a name heard for the first time. I said into the open air, not into the mic, not me. The channel kept its manners. Rivertowns asked for a window. The headmaster with the veranda wanted to know if he could keep the children until the buses found kindness in the sky. Bass relayed the request with that care that makes the back of the mouth go dry. I told them what I could claim. Inflow layered, boundary firm, top steady over the west ridge, no roll across the fall line yet, no drift line toward the passes. I left out that the cliff shimmered in clean segments like panes. I left out the anemometer's private games and the false warmth that visits its housing when nobody is looking. That is not a lie. That is choosing what helps. A short while later, the radio picked up a reply that carried my cadence, but not my meaning. It delivered my last profile in a trimmed voice that sounded like a desk trying to be gentle about bad news. I felt the pull to answer it with the same restraint, to greet my own voice as if it belonged to a colleague and had earned my respect. I chose not to. I asked Bass if they had heard a duplication on their side. The office said only the usual scratch. They asked me to stay high on the channel while a line crew checked ground lines in the middle distance. I said I would hum quietly if the ridge allowed. The afternoon turned its head. The The stack to the west grew shoulders, not in the hurried way that promises a dash and collapse, but in the deliberate temper of something building a spine. The top spread wide and thin, and wore its age like a costume. The falls kept their steady speaking. The iron taste in the air found my tongue again, a breath or two at a time. I read the sling by feel, not out of romance, but because the numbers the mind loves are not permitted in this place. The air cooled where it should have warmed, and warmed where it should have stayed honest. I wrote, cross-patch patches along lip, respect, rope discipline, avoid running steps. Before the dusk push, bass asked for one more sounding, with a face run along the notch where the echo lanes had shown their neat marching the day before. I brought the kid across the flags that had learned to behave, and set my shoes where the ground rings. The radio chose that moment to announce me to myself, call sign without owner first, my name second, then a brief breath that might have been a laugh or wind, and then, in a voice that did not belong to anyone I could place, a weather phrase that old hands use when they tell each other to hold a line. I froze my mouth and let the quiet complete the sentence. The channel rested. I said the phrase back, not to humor it, but to hear it from a human throat. The echo ran the cliff, polite as prayer, and filed itself away. The balloon climbed with attention on the string, as if the air had set up lanes and would find any traveler who drifted out of them. The line stayed taut but kind. At shoulder height, the handheld anemometer ticked without help, then performed a smooth, slow revolution that did not honor the wind on my cheek. I let it finish and then set it flat, palm on housing long enough to feel the temp become ordinary. When I lifted my hand, a chill had gathered where my palm had been, a small cold that did not belong to metal in air. I wiped the spot with my sleeve, and it was gone. I wrote, false pocket underhand, likely evaporative trick. Do not build a church on it. As the light thinned, the ridge began to speak in the low register that means a discharge walking somewhere out of sight. Stone held the sound a breath too long and handed it back with an accent that was not ours. I reported the usual, in the same tone I would have used in any other season. Bass thanked me and asked after my water, my food, my rest. They do that when a week shows teeth. I said the flask was friendly and the stove was behaving. After the sign-off, the channel murmured the call sign again, softer now, then pressed the first half of my given name into the static, with enough tenderness to pass for care. I stood and let that pass through me like weather. I reached for the volume knob, held myself back, and chose to listen instead. Because there are moments when permission matters more than comfort. The cells held their line. The map kept its fist. The valley, which usually spends this hour arranging tiny noises for sleep, sounded rehearsed. The flags did not move. The cliff wore no shimmer. My body kept a ledger of small descents. The chill at the shins, the iron on the tongue, the hairs that rose and sat, the sense that distance could add itself a little at a time if no one watched. I put the notepad against my chest and felt the warm paper take the day's shape. I told myself that pattern requires repetition, and that I still had room to call this coincidence. Then, in the same patient cadence the barometer had adopted, the radio practiced the call sign without owner until it fit the ear like a neighbor, and I understood that the ridge had learned a name it meant to use. Night practiced its exit without conviction, and left the ridge in that flat early light that makes stone look like paper. I woke to the quiet scrape of the tent, finding a new face to lie against, and listened for the small meanings in fabric and cord. The barometer held its long, sober descent. The map lay on the table with its tied lines drawn close enough to steal breath. Across the valley, the column that had built itself day by day did not wander or fray or perform. It simply held its place as if the escarpment had written a rule and the sky had signed. Bass spoke with the stiffness of people who have slept in offices. River towns had set their own watches. The headmaster with the veranda wanted small truths he could hold up in his hand. The desk asked for a face run and a high pass, and they wanted the intervals close. I said I would give them what the ridge allowed, and no more. They thanked me by name. After the click that says courtesy is over, the radio laid the foreign call sign against the channel like a name on a gate. I let it sit. I do not talk to gates. Routine is how a person survives a week that means to argue. I set the kettle, not for comfort, but because steam tells the truth about air. The first thread climbed straight, leaned north, and broke at the shelter lip the way it has been taught. I tightened the guy lines on the field antenna and checked the strap with the gentleness mechanics reserve for metal that knows its job. The strap carried its small winter again, even while the air tried for mild. I touched the mast and felt a grain of sting travel from palm to shoulder, as if the sky had run a finger along the bone. Static will do that when grass is dry. I spoke that sentence aloud so I would not let superstition take the reins. The handheld anemometer behaved until it did not. While I logged the first trace, it began a private spin on the table, blades gliding without rhythm, a kindness compared to their usual chatter, and completely divorced from the wind I could feel on my cheek. I put a flat palm over the housing the way one calms a bird, and waited until the strange will plane, then raised it and met ordinary metal again. I wrote the small line a careful person writes: transient self-start, no heat, suspect residual charge, continue watch. I did not write the thought, my ribs had. The tool wants to speak. The balloon went up and learned the same glass at low height as yesterday. It hesitated, then shouldered through, the line singing the high, thin note that belongs to effort done well. I marked the motion with dull strokes and moved the antenna one slow hand to the north to catch whatever the cliff would admit. The escarpment's face wore no shimmer, which should have calmed me. A sheet of air draped there anyway, a presence my eye refused to draw. The falls across the valley kept their steady rehearsal voice, not louder, not softer, as if someone had convinced water to perform its job like a recording. Bass asked if the range would hold the line. I told them what could be said without theater: cells fixed, tops disciplined, inflow kneeling under the cliff and rising only where stone allowed, no roll across the lip, no arcs toward the passes, storm spine mature and unmoved. They asked for timing windows. I gave them windows with edges made of caution. When the sign-off came, the channel held a breath, then set the ownerless call sign in the space where good manners live. After that, my check phrase returned in a voice that could have been mine if I had been trying to reassure a stranger in the dark. I tightened my grip on the pencil and did not answer. Orders for a relocation arrived wrapped in apology. The desk wanted the portable gauge pulled closer to a gully where a small town sits with its chin on the table, listening for bad news. The path to that gully makes a long slant across stones that like to ring, then finds a broken step that refuses any casual boot. I went because my work is to go, and because the ridge, despite its new habits, still rewards plain service. The flags along the way had decided to behave. Even so, the S around the dolerite stretched by a breath beyond memory. The hairs on my arms made their polite attempt and then stood easy. That trick of distance is a tax the ridge charges now. I paid it without comment. At the gully lip, the hush with angle returned. A smell of crushed onion rose and faded under the cleaner scent of damp rock. I drove the stake until the ground made the small sound that means it has had enough, ran the cable, seated the connectors, and kept a palm on the jacket long enough to feel that faint tack that belongs to warmth without a source. When I keyed the radio for report, the call sign without owner said my name first, and then repeated the weather phrase old hands use when they tell one another to hold a line. Bass, real bass, followed a breath later and asked for confirmation. I confirmed. I did not ask who else thought they had the right to give orders on this channel. The walk back taught the same lesson in stretched distance and tidy patience. Near the boulder that always looks wet, the world put on that precise attention again, as if the ridge had leaned forward. The sound of the falls failed to track with my turn of the head. I forced my mind to choose the boring answer, and succeeded just enough to keep moving. When I reached the table, the barometer needle had advanced along its sober path. The map's tight hand had begun to darken where my fingers rest when I think. The kettle thread rose, learned the roofline's law, and broke, obedient and weary. I took my tea without sugar. Through the middle of the morning, the radio practiced saying the borrowed call sign in my cadence. It rounded one consonant, then another, trying to find a local mouth. Between attempts, it carried traffic like any decent set. Bass asked for finer slices in the face wind, and for any sign of a roll starting where the cliff makes its cleanest leap. I gave them what I could defend. The anemometer returned to honesty when I held it and to mischief when I set it down. The balloon string sang the same brief high note at the boundary and then quieted into plain work. The antenna strap kept its private winter against my wrist. By midday, the column across the valley had taken on the look of a spine that had decided not to bend. The top spread thin and old above a body that refused the impulse to drift. That kind of hold has consequences downrange, and the desk knew it. They asked if the line would break or walk. I said the line would hold. Saying that cost something in the mouth. The headmaster asked, through bass, whether he could keep the children until the buses had a clear road. I told the office what was kind without being foolish. Keep them where the roof is strong, plan for short routes, do not chase open sky. The radio murmured my answer back to me in my own throat, and then, very gently, added a word I had not said. It said my name as if we were old colleagues. I put my hand on the mast and felt the grain of sting again, a small nibble that traveled through bone, and announced the ridge was charged in ways I did not admire. I checked the ground link once more and found it neat, proper, stubborn. The cliff to the north grew a line of darker tone that suggested a roll would begin there if it were allowed. It was not allowed. The storm held its line with the steadiness of a ledger. I could feel in the soles that the week had entered its accounting. Mid-afternoon brought errands wrapped in care. The desk asked for one more face run and a high pass, then suggested I keep the channel open even while boiling water, even while mending a glove, even while I stepped away to consider a private worry, because echoes were odd, and someone downrange had reported a second voice in the public net that had the habit of a human and the content of a mirror. I said I would keep the set on my shoulder. The radio thanked me by the borrowed call sign, and then tried my surname with a small, deliberate hitch on the vowel, learning it like a student who does not want to disappoint the room. Toward evening, the ridge learned a new quiet. It was not the quiet of a place catching its breath. It was the quiet of a place listening to itself. The falls kept their recording voice. The flags did not move. The air where my shins lived cooled, and the air around my chest stayed honest, as if temperature had been cut into lanes and told to obey. The balloon climbed its alley with no complaint. The line remained taut, kind, inevitable. The anemometer ticked once on the table, then sat like a dog that has spent a lifetime pretending it does not understand speech. When the sign-off for the last profile went through, the channel did not close. It stayed an open room. Into that room stepped a voice that had learned my pacing and shed my meaning. It said the weather phrase again, the one about holding the line, and then, as if offering a hand, spoke a call sign I did not know, and then added my given name with the careful affection of a partner who wants to be allowed through a door. I reached for the volume, stopped, and let the moment stand. The cliff to the north darkened a shade that meant business would begin somewhere else if I blinked. The storm held its line. The ridge waited to see whether I would speak first. Dawn did not so much arrive as decide to sit on the rim and watch. The map on my table kept its fist, a tangle of tight lines pressed together until even paper seemed short of breath. The column across the valley held as before, old head on young shoulders, refusing to migrate the way storms with manners do. I woke to the tent cloth finding a new angle and the small conversational sounds of cord against grommet. Routine is the only rope I trust in weeks like this. I set water, not for comfort, but for testimony, because steam does not flatter or lie. The thread rose straight, leaned where the lip tells it to, then wavered without breaking, as if it had learned a tremor and was proud of it. The barometer walked its patient descent with the discipline of a civil servant. I tapped the glass to keep my superstition in harness and laid a palm on the field antenna's grounding strap. Winter lived in that ribbon, even while the air played at mildness. The mast gave me a small sting that traveled along bone and then settled there like an unanswered question. Base wanted the story of the face and the lip in close intervals. River towns had put their own clocks on tables and moved salt shakers like markers, deciding what to do with buses and bridges. The headmaster with the veranda had a new worry about a footpath under the big trees. I listened and wrote and refused to promise anything the ridge had not authorized. When I signed off, the radio left the door ajar. Into that open room came the borrowed call sign spoken in a voice that had studied my pacing until it could slip into it without squeak. After the call sign, it tried my given name the way a careful stranger tries a step on old wood. I put one finger on the volume knob and did nothing. I sent the first balloon early to stack buffers against the hour that would not forgive delay. The string sang at the low pane where the air behaves like glass, then settled into toil. The handheld anemometer on the table turned a single slow revolution of its own will, and then chose honesty the moment it met my hand, like a dog pretending it cannot hear until you say the word that matters. I set it down and let it be selfish. My log said the plain thing. Self-start persists, no temperature rise, suspect charge and mind my own stories. My ribs wrote their private note, tool wants a mouth. The walk to the spur began clean. The flags along the shallow S lay where I had left them, cloths stiff from drift and grudging sun. Midway across the ringing stones, the angle hush took the world again. It is not the silence of fear or sleep. It is the silence of a room that means to hear itself speak. The hairs along my forearms rose half the way, and then remembered manners. When I reached the gully lip, the smell of crushed onion stepped forward and then let damp stone take the room back. I drove the stake, ran the cable, pressed the connectors home until they sighed, and felt that faint tack on the jacket that belongs to heat the day would not admit. I keyed the radio. The call sign without owner came first, then my given name, then the weather phrase old hands use for holding a line. Bass followed close and made it official. I confirmed in the driest voice I own and walked away through the attention, as if smoke could be negotiated with. Back at the table, the barometer was deeper along its errand. The map had darkened at the place where my thumb rests when I think too long. The kettle thread learned its lean and broke on cue. The field antenna stared into the escarpment face, as if something could be coaxed out of rock. I raised it the width of a palm and listened for bite. None. The radio behaved for a few breaths, then placed the borrowed call sign soft in the afterspace of courtesy. I felt the urge to answer like a colleague, to hand it professional warmth, and see what it did with the gift. I did not. I checked the strap, found winter, and told my hands to keep their small work. The range answered before the set did. A breath of wind at shin height longed upslope while the chest kept its honest draw. Early for that, earlier than manners, and steady in a way that read like handwriting. I crouched and gave it the back of my wrist. Cool, not cold. Insistent, not urgent. I wrote the harmless sentence a person writes when they do not want their own notes to betray them later. Early pocket along lip, mind footing. Then the falls across the valley betrayed their trick. Their voice kept steady when I turned my head, steady when I looked down, steady when I looked up. A recording laid over water. I said aloud that refraction and wind create oddities, because sometimes the mouth needs to hear the boring answer. Bass brought errands with apology. They wanted the portable gauge nudged toward a saddle above the headmaster's road. I looked at the sky and at the map and at the sky again, and found the same answer in both. Go. The ridge taxed me the same breadth of distance it has taken each day. Near the boulder that always looks wet, the attention returned. The ground took on the mild spring of a drumhead underfoot. I crossed with the care one gives glass and reached the saddle to find the flags I had set last season huddled a little closer than I remembered, the rare reversal of the stretch I have come to expect. I told myself that memory is a poor yardstick and pushed the stake until the soil refused more. The jacket on the cable held its tack. The connectors exhaled their tiny consent. When I keyed the radio, the range spoke through it before Bass could. It used the call sign without owner, and then my name with the tone of a familiar at a door. It said the weather phrase again, this time with the smallest adjustment, as if it had learned a local vowel. I turned my face to the cliff and spoke the phrase back to the stone. The echo ran the wall with the patience of a procession and folded itself away. The midday sounding rose true, and then found a lane I had not drawn on any page. The string tugged with relief, as if it had stepped into a corridor that let it hurry its business. Above that, the flow slowed into courtesy. The handheld anemometer ticked once, then turned and turned with a softness that did not belong to the wind on my cheek. I set it flat, palm on the housing, and waited until ordinary metal met skin, then kept my hand there while a small cold gathered where warmth ought to have pooled. I wiped the spot with my sleeve and saw nothing change. I wrote the same sentence I wrote yesterday and hated its modesty. Through the early afternoon, the radio made practice into habit. It carried bass cleanly, and then, between transmissions, worked at my cadence the way a student works at a piece until the teacher looks up. Once it threaded a half phrase from the public net, a farmer thanking someone for a tarp, into a shape that bent toward weather talk, and then let it go. Once it spoke a sentence I had never said in a voice that could have been mine if I had spent a winter in another valley. It told me, with my restraint, that the line would hold. I did not argue aloud. My hand found the mast. The sting traveled bone to shoulder and settled there like a penny under the tongue. The column across the valley made a small, decisive change. It did not lean or feather or climb. It ripened, a word I distrust in weather and cannot avoid here. The top broadened until the light made a thin halo at its rim, the kind of rim that says, distance is being eaten without steps. The map kept its fist. The flags along the lip posed for an inspection photograph. The hush with angle grew precise. I began to feel as if I were late to a meeting for which I had never received a time. Errands crowded. Base asked for a face run right now, then asked me to keep the channel open even while boiling water, even while mending the glove I had been meaning to mend. Someone downrange had reported a second voice in the public net that had learned the habit of people without learning content, a mirror that smiled back. I said I would keep the set on my shoulder and gave them the profile I could defend. They thanked me by name. The radio thanked me by the borrowed call sign and then tried my surname again, trimming the vowel the way people do when they want to pass as local. I stood a long moment with my hand on the volume and let the discipline of not touching win. Late afternoon tilted toward a decision. The ridge learned a stillness that felt like the breath held between a question and its answer. The falls kept their recording voice. The pocket at the shins cooled. The chest air stayed honest. The balloon rose in its lane without complaint, line, taut, kind, inevitable. I had just logged the last trace when the radio cracked its knuckles and stepped all the way into the room. It spoke the call sign without owner with the comfort of a neighbor, spoke my given name as if I had given permission for that intimacy, and then, with my own pacing, issued a brief instruction to hold the line and watch the northern buttress for a roll that was not allowed and might arrive anyway. The words were mine, the authority was not. I lifted the mic and held it at my mouth and did nothing. The cliff to the north took on a darker shade along a seam I had been watching all day. The barometer kept its clean descent. The strap wore winter. The map stayed a fist. The range had learned to speak to me in my voice. I put the mic down without keying. I set the kettle so steam could testify again. The thread rose, leaned, and trembled as before. I walked to the lip and placed a palm on stone. It answered with deep chill, and, beneath that, a living thud a person might mistake for a far discharge if they wanted comfort. I did not want comfort. I wanted accuracy. I said, aloud and plain, that I would not take instructions from echoes. The radio, gentle as older kin, repeated my check phrase with a hitch it had stolen from my habits and waited to see whether I would bless this arrangement by answering. I wrote in the log the driest sentence I could manage. Secondary speaker persistent. No evidence of external station. Maintain discipline. Do not anthropomorphize. The hand that wrote shook enough to leave more graphite than necessary. Evening edged the escarpment in a dull metal light. The column across the valley wore its age without apology. The air kept its lanes. The flags held court. Somewhere down in the river town, salt shakers had been moved and then moved back. The range had answered back and would expect an answer in return. I stood inside the small republic of my instruments and felt the week pull tight around the ridge like a belt one notch closer. I lifted the mic again, and the set, polite as a guest, yielded the room. I kept the set on my shoulder through the thinning light and tried to keep my thoughts small. The map would not be persuaded. It pressed its tide lines tight until the paper read like bark under the heel. The column across the valley wore its old head without moving, a magistrate who had decided to hear one more case before night. I boiled water because steam does not flatter, and because watching the thread rise tells you what the air is willing to confess. It climbed true, leaned at the lip, trembled as if proud of its new trick, then broke, obedient as ever. I tapped the barometer glass to keep my superstition from growing legs. The needle walked the clean descent with a public servant's spine. The field antenna's strap held its pocket of winter with the stubbornness of a habit that will not be argued out of a room. I touched the mast and felt the small sting move up bone, settle in the shoulder, and wait there the way a question waits when it knows it will be taken up again soon. Base came with errands wrapped in care. The headmaster with the veranda had kept his children and needed a truth that fit in the palm. River towns were counting bridges. The desk asked for a face run and a high pass, short intervals, the kind of cadence you reserve for moments when you fear a wrong decision will multiply. I gave them what the ridge allowed. I did not dress the truth. After their thanks, the channel left the door open a little wider than manners allow. Into that open room stepped the borrowed call sign. Comfortable now, a name on a gate one learns to stop questioning because the gate has always been there. After the call sign came my given name in a tone you would use at a door you have already been invited through. Then the weather phrase old hands used to tell each other to hold a line, followed by a new piece, a suggestion to shift the portable gauge one spur north because a roll would take breath there first. The words were plain, the cadence mine, the authority not. I set the mic on the table and let the room absorb the instruction without granting it rank. Routine will answer where courage hesitates. I took the anemometer in my hand to ask for honesty, and it gave me honesty, blades turning at the rate my cheek could bless. When I set it down, the instrument remembered its private language and turned once without help, a slow, quiet revolution that would have been kindness if it were not wrong. I laid a palm over the housing until metal returned to plain metal and kept the hand there long enough to feel a cold bloom beneath the warmth my skin should have left. I wiped the spot, found nothing to see, and returned to the log with the sentence I hated for its modesty. Self-start persists, no heat. Suspect charge, mind my own stories. The ribs penned their private counterline. The tool has learned to mouth shapes. I took the gauge and walked, because that is what a person does when the ridge asks a question and the desk cannot take the step for you. The flags behaved until the stones began to ring. The shallow S around the dolerite stretched itself a breath longer again. Not a lie, a persuasion. The hush with angle settled over the world, like a held breath in a room where too many people have already agreed to be quiet. At the boulder that always looks wet, the attention turned precise. The skin at my shins cooled. My chest kept its ordinary draw. The falls across the valley spoke in their recording voice, as if someone had convinced water to recite. I crossed the drumhead ground with the care a glass worker would recognize, and reached the spur above the headmaster's road. The flags I had set last season stood a touch closer than my legs remembered, the rare reversal. I let that reversal stand without thanks. I drove the stake until the soil refused further argument, ran the cable, pressed the connectors until they sighed, and kept my hand on the jacket while the faint tack declared heat that the air would not admit. When I keyed the radio, the range used it before base could. Callsign without owner first, then my name, then the phrase about holding a line in my own gate, then a clean instruction, remain where you are, and confirm the northern seam. Base followed with the official request to return to the table for a face run and a high pass now. Orders and field reality have never been fast friends. I stood with 1 foot on duty and 1 foot on stone and let a thin anger pass through my jaw. The set, patient as older kin, offered the call sign again as if to lighten my load by taking the choice out of my hands. I told it no without speaking. I told it no by lifting the gauge and shouldering it for the return. The distance taxed its now familiar breath. The stones rang exactly where they always ring, which should have comforted and did not. Halfway back, a thread of cold reached from the lip to the crook of my knee and held there while the chest air stayed ordinary. A small pocket of iron taste rose on the tongue and then left like a thought one chooses not to have. I came to the table and set the gauge down too carefully. The barometer had burrowed deeper into its task. The map's fist darkened under the weight of my thumb. The kettle thread stood, leaned, trembled, and broke, repeating itself with the calm of ritual. I lifted the antenna a breath and looked for bite in the mast, and found none beyond the thin sting that announces a place has learned to speak in shock. I keyed the radio and gave base the face profile, in a voice I keep for rooms where no one can afford theater. Top steady, no roll across the fall line. Inflow layered and polite. Upslope pocket at shin height, early and persistent. Echo lanes along the cliff as before. The desk thanked me and asked if I could admit one more high pass before dusk. The bus routes had been drawn like veins on kitchen tables, and the salt shakers had been moved and moved again. I said yes, because this is the week. When the sign-off came, the channel declined to close. Into the after courtesy, a human voice returned my check phrase with my patience, and then, as if we had been colleagues for years, said the phrase about holding a line and added a simple request that did not belong to any desk I knew. Stay. The balloon took the string, as if eager to prove it had studied. It met the glass pane at low height and shouldered through. Above that, it found a lane inclined against the stone, not allowed and uninterested in permission. The line sang a high, thin note that belongs to good work done under pressure. I tracked it with dull pencil and refused to sharpen the point because sharp leads make a person confess more than the page needs. The anemometer on the table performed its single, slow revolution and then lay still, a well-behaved animal who thinks behaving earns a treat. I ignored it and moved to the lip. The escarpment gave me its real face. The shimmer returned in short, tidy segments, like panes of a window installed along the fall line, each pane fixed in a space the eye cannot measure but knows. Down on the valley floor, something with wheels moved, then did not, then moved again, as if a decision had been rehearsed and revised. The falls spoke their recording voice. The hush with angle deepened, until even the small talk of fabric and cord fell quiet. I put a palm on stone and waited for the deep chill to tell me I was alive. It obliged. Under that, a soft thud lived. Not the harsh report of a strike, but the heartbeat of mass settling more firmly into itself. I removed my hand and made myself breathe to a count that avoids numbers. The radio called me by the borrowed call sign with the ease of a neighbor leaning on a fence. It spoke my name the way people speak in kitchens when they are tired and kind. It told me to hold the line and to watch the northern seam. It did not sound excited or stern. It sounded inevitable. I lifted the mic and did not key. I waited long enough to teach myself who was in charge of my thumb. The set waited with me, patient and pleased. Behind its voice, the cliff made a sound like cloth pulled across a floor. Bass broke in with a list that would hold a town together for the hour. Bridges to close, crossings to delay, a pulsing request for confirmation about the seam. I answered in plain terms, kept the verbs calm, laid out what could be defended. Then the channel filled with humanity. Farmers, a driver, a distant patrol, and the old net carried fear with the dignity of people who must work anyway. Through that, just under the human field, the borrowed call sign threaded a second conversation with my pulse, practicing my breath until it matched the walk of the barometer needle. Once, briefly, it said the headmaster's name. I hated that. I told the set to stop without granting it a sound to carry. The last balloon climbed and vanished into the lane that the map had never drawn for me. The line lightened, then settled, then leaned as if someone outside my hand had lifted it an inch and waited to see if I noticed. I let the string find its own argument and refused to answer the invitation. I turned my back to the edge because sometimes professional courage is simply leaving a place while it believes it could keep you. The flag stood with a ceremony that felt unsympathetic. The strap kept winter, the kettle cooled. The room with my instruments in it made the small, domesticated noises people use to disguise dread. I keyed the radio to tell bass that I would hold on channel while the ridge decided what kind of night it intended to have. The set took my words and returned them in my tone. Then, with a tenderness that did not belong on any frequency I have worked, added a phrase I have never said aloud, the kind of phrase a person uses when they are about to touch a shoulder. It told me, using my restraint, to step out to the northern buttress and look down, once and only once. The cliff to the north darkened along the seam I had watched all week. The falls dropped their voice for the span of a breath, and then found it again. The hush with angle learned a new weight. I put the mic down, and the room felt the absence as if a companion had chosen not to sit. I walked to the lip because the work asked me to, and because there are moments when caution becomes a kind of failure. The stone took my boots the way it always has. The air at my shins cooled. My chest kept its honesty. The flags refused to move. I went to the buttress and set my toes where the rock insists the view is honest and fair. The ridge leaned, not outward, not inward, but toward a future that had already been written in a ledger I had not signed. I looked down once, as the stolen voice had asked, and saw the escarpment's face hold a line that no storm with manners should hold. A thin, regular flicker ran the seam like a wire being plucked by an unseen hand. The radio at my shoulder opened the room without me and spoke my name with gratitude. Then the call sign without owner said a word that could have been wait or could have been now, and the ground beneath the seam took a breath that did not belong to stone.